And welcome Dr. Nicole Tetreault. Nicole is a compassionate neuroscientist, author, meditation teacher, and international speaker on topics of neurodiversity, neurodevelopment, creativity, mental health, and wellness. And her book, Insight into a Bright Mind, explores groundbreaking research examining the experiences of unique, creative, and intense brains through interviews, storytelling, and literary science, while advocating for new directions of human diversity and neurodiversity. I'm looking forward to reading this one, just out today, and she'll give you more information about that. As the founder of Awesome Neuroscience, Nicole translates the most promising neuroscience and positive psychology for people to live their best life. Nicole has authored numerous articles, academic papers, journal articles on intelligence, autism, brain evolution, neuroinflammation, and behavior. She's a faculty member of Bridges Graduate School of Cognitive Diversity and Education. And as recipient of the Milton Career Exploration Prize from Caltech, she founded the novel nonprofit Beyond the Cell, a transformative program to rehabilitate incarcerated women through guided meditation, neuroscience, literature, and expressive writing. And tonight, her topic is Insight into a Bright Mind, the latest neuroscience of giftedness, twice-exceptionality, and living as liberated beings. Thank you for being here with us tonight, Dr. Tetreault.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark and Annette. I'm really delighted to be here with you and with your community. Moments like this, you know, especially during the pandemic, I think are so important and vital that there's the support for gifted families and educators and clinicians. So it's my pleasure to be here. So with that, I will take it away. So everybody, as you know, Nicole, I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to kind of go over what we're going to talk about. And as you know, I am a meditation teacher, so I will like to do a short meditation with you, as well as talk to you about the brain, one of my favorite things to talk about. And so, let's get you here. So yeah, there we go. So today we're going to really explore looking into the gifted brain and really the neuroanatomy and the networks that are unique, asynchrony, and what it really means and looks like in asynchronous development and behaviors. And also we're going to look at neurodiversity and how that really plays out when you think about different types of exceptionalities and behaviors that we see. We're going to go over gifted emotions and how potentially we can have hardwired behaviors related to emotional intensities. And we're going to look a little bit at emotional maturation and how that plays out in our gifted and 2E population. And then different practices that I think that are really important for us to nurture the creative and gifted soul and spirit. And so, like I said, I am a meditation teacher, so I am going to ask you to take a moment with me, if you can, and just settle for a moment. I know Zooming, Facebooking, living, and all of this, it takes so much time for us to just take a moment and be on our screens. And I'm going to invite you to just take a moment and close your eyes and settle into your chair. And just take a nice breath in and breathe in for 1, 2, and breathe out for 1, 2. And I'm going to ask you to just focus on where your breath is resonating, perhaps in your nostrils. You can feel it in your throat, in your chest, or maybe even all the way down to your diaphragm if you're taking nice deep breaths. And I'd like you to take a second here and see if you can find out where the word gifted thinking about the word gifted resonates in your body. Just that word, gifted. And where in your body do you feel that word gifted? And breathe in for 1, 2, and breathe out for 1, 2. And as you're noticing where it resonates in your body, I'd like you to just place your hand there for a moment. And imagine you're just sending a little extra oxygen to that area in your body. And breathe in for 1, 2. And now I'd like you to shift your awareness to the predominant emotion that's arising with the word gifted. Whether that's joy, frustration, excitement, when you think of the word gifted. And just sit with whatever that emotion is. And breathe out for 1, 2, and inhale for 1, 2. Now I'd like you to shift your awareness to the predominant story you're telling yourself about the word gifted. What's the story? Is the story, my kid's gifted, I'm gifted? And breathe in to whatever that predominant story is. And release. And breathe in for 1, 2, and breathe out for 1, 2. And I want you to just shift your awareness back to the room. If you could blink your eyes open. Maybe you had your eyes open. You can rub your fingers together. And I do this specifically because I like us to consider, just when we have that word gifted, a single word tells a story. A single word resonates in our body. A single word can elicit multiple emotions, a single emotion. It can elicit different types of actions and behaviors. And in particular, I call this the circle of awareness, where our thoughts and our autobiographical memories and the stories we tell ourselves really are running the show in our mind. And more often than not, it's been recorded that we have approximately 60,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot of thoughts. Thoughts are incessant. Now, I'm not sure about if 60,000 is exactly right. They're calculating between 12 to 14 hours of wakefulness, a thought per second. Could be a little high, could be a little low. But regardless, our thoughts are incessant. And most importantly, our emotions are meant for us to take action. So we have these 7 core emotions. There's been 27 emotions identified in humans. But more importantly, we have these 7 core emotions of fear, anger, sadness, disgust, surprise, anticipation, joy, and trust. And I like to point out, when you think about fear and anticipation, they both elicit a very similar physiological response. They both elicit sweaty palms, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and you can easily attach to fear or anticipation. And so it's really important to notice that our emotions are really created for us to take thought and to take an action and to do something. And the next thing is that our bodily sensations, such as touch, taste, smell, hearing, and vision, those are all really critical for the way that we interact with the world and we perceive the world. And more often than not, we know the receptivity in gifted individuals and twice exceptional individuals, there's an elevated receptivity in sensory domains. That being said, it creates different reactions and behaviors. And so, like I said, our emotions create our actions and behaviors. But just when you think about that, if a person is experiencing the world at an elevated state, if the person's experiencing the world with a different type of receptivity, that individual is going to have different types of behaviors, perhaps different types of communication, and different types of expressions. And so the reason I point that out is that I'd like us to really consider, we talk about normal behaviors and reactions, but if you have an individual who has a different type of receptivity and a different type of brain priming, they're going to have different types of behaviors and reactions than we are normally used to. And so when we think about the gifted identity, many people have identified that individuals have a physical intensity where they can tend to move quite a bit more. From Dabrowski's work, from Susan Bound's work, from James T. Webb, Linda Silverman, all the, all the big names that we've been thinking about. And this, these individuals can have a high level of excitability. So that could be excitability in response to the environment, as well as an internal excitability. Often these individuals are intellectually curious. So there's this great level of inquiry, and with that comes great level of doubt, right? That I'm not sure this is right, with that continually questioning. They're highly imaginative and creative. And being in a highly imaginative and creative state, they can have imaginary friends, imaginary universes, imaginary things going on in their mind that they're not even communicating to us, because they're in their default mode network. And so their executive functioning and their communication skills are kind of dampened because they're in their imagination. And then you have individuals where they show to be highly independent. They could be, working on a Lego building project for days on end, with a very intense hyper focus, and getting them to transition from one activity to the other can be quite challenging. Also, these kids could be highly multi-interested, where one week they want to do the violin, the next week they want to do tap dances. So save your money on, the most expensive purchase, because they tend to like to move fluidly, through their different passions. And there's also a real high sensory receptivity. It could be related to emotional responses as well, and their cognitive responses. And then there tends to be an enhanced emotional depth, where there's, this intricate relationship with how to find justice in the world, and this intense idea of fairness. And so when we think about that, more often than not, when we think about in education, and I think many of you being parents and educators and psychologists in the field, that there's just so many types of misinformation, that gifted students are straight A students. We know that to not be totally true. Gifted students excel at everything, school, sports, and socially. We know that there tends to be challenges across some areas. Gifted students will be fine in a regular classroom with extra work. We know that is false. Giving more work, actually, of the same type of work decreases brain activity. So it's not good for a child. Gifted students don't have learning disabilities or differences. That's totally false. And it goes all the way back to Letta Hollingworth in the early years, reporting how there were exceptionalities in gifted children. Gifted students don't need help. They could figure it out on their own. We know that to not be true. Gifted students are teachers' favorites and model students sometimes, and sometimes they could be the most challenging student. They excel. If you excel a student, it'll harm their social and emotional development. We know that actually to not be true, that when you excel a child in and you build their strength, it actually is very positive for their individual development. Gifted students are similar. We know if you teach gifted students, if you have gifted children, that they could be completely different across the spectrum. So twice-exceptionality is really a co-occurrence of exceptional gifts combined with complexities of a learning difference or a number of learning differences. And also, I don't have it in the slide, but I think emotional things to consider, like anxiety and depression, can be another form of individual experiencing twice exceptionality. And really, human intelligence is multifaceted, where each individual illuminates at their own wavelength and frequencies. And a key element of being 2E is being creative and unconventional thinking. And so we know that more often than not, I kind of talk about this as the gifted disconnect. Here's my report card and here's my personal disclaimer. And we know often that for a number of reasons that a gifted student can come back with their grades all over the place, an A here, a C here, an F here. And it could be related to a number of things. It could be, one, the curriculum isn't stimulating, therefore there's no motivation. It may not be meeting their level. Another thing that could be happening is they could have an unidentified learning difference that could be masking their true ability. But more often than not, if these issues aren't kind of addressed and helped for the child, really the child could suffer deep kind of emotional challenges where they can have low self-esteem and low motivation. And so most importantly, it's really critical to identify where the breakdown is happening in that setting. And also to point out that academics isn't the only thing. And then sometimes it looks like this. You have your super bright kids and getting to class and following directions and executive functioning is really challenging. And then other times it looks like this, where you have a child in first grade math or kindergarten math, and that is not gonna satisfy their appetite, that they need to be accelerated. And one piece of advice here is, often when we approach the strength-based model, a child kind of devours the curriculum. They end up meeting age match. They end up meeting peers, and it may not be age match, but it may be peers where they can communicate about their shared interest. The other thing that I think is really important is just because a child really excels at something, it doesn't really mean that that's what they want to do, especially when you're thinking about math, for example. You may have a child who wants to be a musician or an artist. And so really asking them where they want to excel and be excelled, I think is very important as well. To not kind of force and tell that child, you're going to be an engineer or, an architect or a mathematician, because it may not interest them. So why study giftedness? For me, like you, my son was identified gifted in 3rd grade. He was reading at college level. Everyone thought, oh, isn't that fantastic? Isn't that great? And we were in a parent-teacher conference, and I was kind of learning about Spencer's behaviors at recess and lunch, that he didn't really care to go outside and play with kids because, as he said, the kids are too much. And I thought, he needs to be socializing. This isn't normal. He doesn't need to be sitting in the library reading all day. And it was an aha moment when I had to reset my idea of what I thought normal was, and really see my kid for who he is and saying, no, I go to the library and I read and I have the best time, and I'm able to take a break. And his teacher pointed out, which was so amazing, that Spencer doesn't need any fixing or need anything to change. He's absolutely fine the way he is, and he's already self-regulating. There isn't anything that needs to be done. And I think so often, we expect these kids to fit into a box, and it's really not fair to them. And, with my son, we learned his reading goal at the time was to not read while the teacher was lecturing and read at appropriate times. And, lo and behold, he's in high school. He's a social kid. He plays in sports, and so he developed asynchronous, his own way in his own path. And I think that that's something that we need to really listen to what our children are telling us, rather than what we expect our children to be and do. And so, you know, a lot of this, when we're trying to have these gifted children conform to a box, they're not going to fit into a standard box. They're unconventional thinkers. And the way I think about it, you know, it's not a box. It's like a kaleidoscope or a series of Venn diagrams where you're having circles overlapping and overlapping and overlapping with their kind of beautiful essence and originality. And that really gets us to how this correlates in the brain. And you know, one thing that when I was in graduate school that we learned, you know, 86 known brain regions and the functions. And this study in 2016 kind of came out and knocked my socks off, because in graduate school, I looked at human brain tissue under microscope, and I really noticed that no two brains, no section were alike. And I knew that there was this vast diversity. And what this study really kind of showed was what I always thought to be true. And they were able to identify 97 new cortical regions by using a novel software. And so all of these brain scans, what they did is they imaged brains in an MRI, and then they came back and they used a novel type of software where they were able to parcelate out the brain even deeper and identify 97 new regions, twice the number that was previously known. So now there are like 180 distinct brain regions to give better specificity of uniqueness. And what was even cooler is that with a 97%, you know, detection rate, they were able to identify an individual's brain like a fingerprint. So basically, we have our very own unique brain print. So each of us has our own type of nervous system, which totally makes sense. And so what I really like to advocate is neuroindividuality is the new normal, not this idea that we have to conform to some sort of idea. And I really love this quote from Maya Angelou: if you're always trying to be normal, you'll never know how amazing you can be. And I bring this up and I bring up her quote because her impact, you know, she suffered serious trauma very early on, and she was a selective mute at age 9 for 5 years. And to think about what it is to be a selective mute, to not speak, to not communicate, and for her to have been one of the most, you know, profound writers of our lifetime, I think says a great deal that sometimes we put kids in a box when perhaps they're not verbalizing or communicating in the way that we expect them to. And there's a whole mind going on in there. There's a whole imagination, there's a whole human being. And so we kind of need to reframe, am I normal, to what makes you unique? And if we can really help these kids identify, and adults, you know, I think parents, when they find out that their kids are gifted, all of these little things come out for themselves, like, oh, this sounds like me. And so if you could come back and reframe, you know, what makes you unique, and kind of shift that story, shift that, you know, just like I did the meditation for us early on, you know, we could have done it on normal, right? We could have meditated on the word normal and where did it resonate in us, or abnormal. And so we have really the power to shift the dialogue, and we can help these kids kind of better come into self-actualization by helping them identify their strengths and what makes them unique. So over the past 4 years, and aside, you know, the past 14, you know, before that, you know, studying the brain, you know, I spent the last 4 years really focusing on the literature, and I did a real in-depth literature review of over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles about the human brain and intelligence. And that's kind of what I culminated. I have an article up in GHF that I did, and then it's also really kind of written out in my new book. And, you know, what I really, a lot of these studies looked at MRI and fMRI, so neuroimaging. A lot were survey reports, and to really kind of best identify what we're looking at when we're thinking about the bright brain and what it means. And I'm only going to give you a piece of the gifted brain. I looked in autism. I also looked in ADHD and dyslexia and creativity. But we're going to just get a snapshot of what the results were when I looked at the gifted brain. And mainly there's 11 types of things that I found kind of come up over and over and over in the literature. And the first one was that the development of the brain is asynchronous. And where in particular, we know that the frontal cortex, this part of your brain, really expands extensively in adolescence between ages 9 to 14 in gifted individuals. And more importantly, that area of the brain develops all the way into our mid-30s. And so neuroplasticity is kind of happening all throughout our life. As I did a meditation with you in the beginning, we know that meditation actually rewires the brain as well. So also, gifted individuals have increased brain volume for sensory, motor, visual, and visual processing and executive functioning, which is known as about 28 brain regions for the PFIT model. They possess more efficient processing at the microstructure of neurons. So we have these ways that cells communicate, and they just communicate more efficiently. They have greater myelin fibers. So that's really the way the brain communicates across different brain regions. So that's, when you're thinking about it, that's like the freeway system. And so the efficiency and the way the networks are built are in more parallel and just run more efficiently. They demonstrate differences in information processing, either rapid or delayed, and it's paradoxical. They learn information at an accelerated rate. They experience heightened brain activation, where when they're provided with greater intellectual challenges, they have considerable flow. They exhibit exceptional sensory receptivity and sensitivity. They have enhanced maturation for emotional processing. They show many converging neural networks lit up in MRI scans when in flow. And they express flexible and novel thinking for manipulating information. And so getting back to the main point is that gifted people have these extraordinary abilities and challenges. And in particular, it shows up as asynchronous. And in particular, I have here developmentally advanced, expected, and delayed. Now, expected I put because that's what the constructs of society put for us. But people really develop in their own timelines. And, so I point out here, you may have a child, for example, who's reading grade levels ahead. And when it gets to the test, they have problems with written production, maybe due to dysgraphia or stealth dyslexia, and they can't produce written product. And therefore, their intellectual ability is being masked. You could have a child, for example, who is a gifted artist. They could spend hours in flow, and then that same child could forget about deadlines and have issues with losing things. You can have a child who, for example, is a great mathematical whiz, and that same child cannot tie their own tennis shoes. And, just for all you parents out there, if you're dealing with a kid where their fine motor or, motor skills are delayed, I took a little while to tie my shoes. It turned out okay. And Velcro works too. So there's those kind of options as well. So when we're thinking about a lens through neurodiversity and seeing 2E, I like to point out that it's really unique brain types. And it arises from distinctive brain wiring and nervous system processing, which can lead to extraordinary thinking, creative, enhanced emotional processing, and novel behaviors and actions. Neurodivergence is found in many groups, like autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, and giftedness. Also, we know for different types of emotional processing, there's different types of networks as well. And it's found in approximately 20% of the population. So, meaning 1 in 5 kids in the classroom, meaning 1 in 5 people in your boardroom. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about society that there is this great diversity kind of at our fingertips. And, neurodiverse people are really hardwired to be creative and think outside the box. They kind of don't really flow in the standard constructs from time to time. And so it's really important to nurture the whole child, their gifts, their complexities, and kind of all their uniqueness. And so when I look at this, I really, and when I made this slide, I haven't changed it, but I was like, is anyone ever really 100% anything? But when we think about asynchronous development, you could have a kid, for example, with this advanced ability, this intellectual ability, and then their emotional regulation just is quite delayed, where their development of their emotional kind of processing and communication just can't be at what their peers is. And sometimes it can be related to, say, for example, that child has an expansion in sensory processing. That child could be having a reaction to an environmental trigger that can cause severe pain, causing emotional dysregulation. And if that brain for emotional processing isn't quite up to their intellectual abilities, you're going to see a child with deemed as bad behavior or disruptive. And so it can just be, that there's just this developmental delay, and also to really identify where the origin of the challenge occurs. And then you could have a kid, where they're this high EQ, where, in the classroom, they want fairness, and, there's this soul that really wants, to save every homeless person they see. And then their kind of other development is delayed. And so, these are kind of your old souls. So you can have these variations happening in all of these types of kids. And so what do I think is happening? Really, we know that executive functioning, it really is centered in this frontal area of the brain where you make decisions. And it takes time for that area of the brain to develop. Like I said, it develops all the way to our mid-30s. And when you have a kid, you can have processing speed that comes across as either too fast or too slow. On top of it, you can have the white matter across different brain regions developing, and things cannot be fully in alignment, where you can have crisscrosses and you can have things take longer to process. We know that when fibers kind of grow together and they're in unison, you have greater connectivity to go back and forth. But what can happen too is you could also have an intellectually developed brain where you could have kind of multiple processes happening at once. And so these kids could come across as either inactive or hyperactive. You could have that kid where they can't stop blurting out the answer because they're so excited, or you could have a kid who's really pondering a question in depth and looking at it, in 10 or 11 different ways when the teacher's looking for a single answer. And so what does a slow processing speed mean? And I kind of brought these questions out to kind of for us to think about in giftedness and twice-exceptionality. So what really accounts for a slower processing speed? Is it a bad thing? Are there upsides to a slower processing speed? And, what would account for a faster processing speed? And is that a good or a bad thing? And in a culture that's kind of working toward a mindful collective consciousness, is a slower processing speed and it advantageous? I throw that out there because, I think we put so much pressure on these kids to perform. And I think that when we kind of learn their unique way of learning, we can kind of bring out their natural talents and gifts. And this is what was a great study. This actually didn't make it into my book because it came out after, but it's a fantastic study where they did an fMRI. So an fMRI is where you do a functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you have subjects in the scanner performing a task, and then they measure brain activity. And so what they did is they took children, well, youngsters from ages 8 to 23, and they had them over 690 subjects, and they had them in the scanner perform a task for about 17 minutes. And what they found was what we all know to be true. And it's going to be, you're going to knock your socks off. So each individual has a unique brain network activation in response to learning and thinking. So this goes in alignment with neuroindividuality. When you're thinking, we each have our own brain networks. Well, now we have that in response to learning. So the activation matches that. And executive functioning is a predictor of congruency of functional brain networks. So what that means is that what I was telling you about, when you have that white matter going across, that the more parallel structures that are already developed, the better somebody can do an executive functioning type of task. Brain networks reorganize and develop in adolescence. So as I mentioned, we have that massive brain expansion happening between ages 9 through 14. So that's no surprise. Brain activation patterns predict brain maturation of an individual. So rather than the actual physical age, the brain patterns tell you how mature the individual's brain is. And there's vast plasticity and diversity in brain anatomy during development, which is no surprise. And what they really pointed out is personalized therapies are paramount for individual brain differences. So when we do that, 40 minutes. Okay. And so I am going to just point us here. The best supports for a 2E and gifted learner is create a safe environment for them where they can process their own surroundings and speak and behave freely to be themselves, build their strengths, identify the origin of their learning style, find out what they love and let them run with it, engage with like minds through activities, allow them to learn at their own pace, and implement appropriate accommodations and encourage divergent thinking, and let them know they're not alone. One major thing that I want you to know is social connection is the #1 predictor for longevity and purpose and meaning. And so get your kids involved in activities that they love. The relationships will naturally develop based on the activity. And really, when you're developing a whole child, compassion and listen. Learning models are really important, such as blueprint and strength-based learning. Understand their individual learning style, dual, tri, and quad identification. So see what their differences are, create safe environments, social and emotional development, meaningful engagement, individual neurobiology and physiology, asynchronous development, and differences in communication and production. And as human beings, our job in life is to help people realize how rare and valuable each one of us really is, that each of us has something that no one else has or will ever have, something that is unique to all time. Fred Rogers. And if you want to connect with me, this is my information. My book is out today. You could get it on Amazon. They're going to have an e-version. So if you need to make the print bigger or smaller. And so just, there's tons of information packed in it. You can reach out to me via email, check out my website. I have a number of articles there. And really thank you for being here and spending this time with me. And I will exit this and we will go to, I'll stop sharing and we could go here.
Oh, thank you so much. I've a part of the many things that I was trying to process was I'm so glad that you had the slide about the slower processing speed.
Yeah.
And I've been working with gifted kids for over 20 years, and this has come up so many times. And I don't know that necessarily I really stopped to dive into it. But I do know that there's a good thing was happening. I have a fast processing speed, and I could not keep up with you. I was writing down notes and doing screenshots and making and putting all these notes down about questions I wanted to ask. And so that's a really good sign in a presentation. So thank you so much for challenging my processing speed and allowing me to slow down for a second there. And I did get bogged down for a second with that slow processing speed question. But we do have some questions that were submitted in advance, and I think people will be populating the chat with some questions as well. I'm going to start it off with one of my own questions that I'm curious about. Just it's a sort of a summary question. And it's a good thing to ask a scientist. So up to 20%, one fifth of the population is neurologically diverse. Does neurodiversity imply giftedness? Is it parallel to giftedness? Is it wholly separate from giftedness? Other things at play when we're talking about that 20%?
Yeah. So when in my estimations, neurodiversity encompasses giftedness. And the reason is that it has to do with different brain wiring and different processing. And so when you're looking at it as a whole, you also have dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and then that's where you get into the 2E-ness if you're gifted and having a co-occurrence of something like that. So I do feel that giftedness is part of the neurodiversity spectrum. And more often than not, I do think there are overlaps due to the fact of the asynchronies. And I think, a lot of when I talk to people, and I'm sure with all of your work, the emotional processing, and the emotional development and the social emotional development is such a huge piece that even, I pointed out in my book, when we look into anxiety and depression, that could even overlap with giftedness and be a 2E-ness, right? Because if a child's depressed or anxious, that could be masking their gifts as well. And so, yeah, but in my definition, I definitely feel that neurodiversity includes giftedness.
Well, then this one is related. This was asked in advance. And so how do we account for systems, environmental bias, deciding which hard wiring is to be deemed gifted or intense?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. Without like having a specific follow-up question, if you're looking at sensory processing versus emotional processing, I think when we look at standard gifted tests, right? You have the WISC, you have, all the battery of tests. And we know that obviously you could be missing a child in those. They don't account for creativity. They specifically look at an executive functioning network, which is called the PFIT, that involves 28 different brain regions. So if you have a kid who's profoundly gifted, but has slower processing speed in one of those brain areas, you can, miss them. Second, when you're thinking about environment and intensities, if, for example, you have a child who is gifted and they have enhanced, let's just go back to sensory processing, where even just sounds, fluorescent sounds, lights activate them with the sound, airplanes, blowers, that they could have a biological systems reactivity, a nervous system reactivity because their body is primed. And so primed for that. So when you're looking at it, I think that without it being like looking at a very specific brain area or a specific type of behavior, it's hard to like make a generalization. But I think what it comes back to, what's the origin, that you're considering and you're looking at, in what you're measuring in terms
Yeah.
of giftedness versus, and I mean, that's the other thing too, is if a child is highly sensory sensitive or has high receptivity, that could dampen their giftedness because they could be wanting to tune out their environment because they're in pain. And so that's how it would play into it when you think about it that way.
Tons of food for thought.
Yeah.
I'm in a pretty large urban school district, and all of the identifications in my district come through my computer. So I'm looking at all the data of every kid that we identify. And I often wonder about outlying scores. And you just gave me a lot to think about, and what an injustice we do so many times, identifying with data. But we work with what we have so often. But I wonder how often we miss kids, and do we miss as many kids as we identify? And just more food for thought for me. And a question from one of our members. Again, you may have covered this, but hardwiring versus neuroplasticity. How are we to interplay these two extremes in the model that you present?
Yeah. And so, I hope that you got from the talk that there is a high level of neuroplasticity for the brain. And I actually talk about how asynchrony and neuroplasticity are parallel in a lot of ways. And in particular, from that one slide, I hope you got that there is a vast amount of neuroplasticity happening during adolescence, as well as, in particular, when you focus on a strength-based model, you can really enrich that child's brain network for that particular exceptionality. On top of it, if a child needs support, as that study suggested, it's so important that you bring in individualized therapies that are unique to that child. And then there was a third that I had, and I just lost it. But the other thing that I think that's really important when we think about, applying the strength-based model, is that when you do that, you're allowing natural brain growth to happen. And so, yeah, our brains are never done. And, as I mentioned, when you're doing meditation, you have brain networks. If you do it up to 8 weeks, that kind of reorganize based on developing the frontal cortex for better emotional processing and saliency and things like that. So there's a vast amount of plasticity that is available. And what I mean about the word hardwired is that we're all kind of preset. And so sometimes, you may have a child that has a sensory processing, as I've kind of come back to, where, it's going to take them a little more time to learn safety within that environment and identify what the triggers are. But some people just have a higher level of sensory receptivity than others. And so that's what I mean about kind of that neuroindividuality.
A related question from somebody in the chat: is there increased neuroplasticity for gifted folks as sometimes out of the box thinkers?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And I think that, kind of, what that one study, Shaw shows, is that early, when you're looking at ages 9 through 14, there's this advanced development happening in adolescence of the frontal cortex. But the frontal cortex is really important, not only for executive functioning, but it's also important in part of our imagination and things like that. And even with the work of Scott Barry Kaufman, showing that how networks, how individuals are more creative thinkers that tend to be, twice exceptional or gifted, that they're in this kind of default mode network, where this is your imagination network, which is different than your executive functioning. And when you're in that network, there's tons of brain activity going on. And so if you're kind of building that creative, imaginative network, then absolutely there's going to be neuroplasticity moving in that direction.
I like how you describe building the creativity network in your brain. That seems so true, just anecdotally. Recently, there's been some questioning about intensity and giftedness.
Mm.
There's some people asking questions about that, and um, the questioning of the notion that giftedness and intensities go hand in hand. From a gifted neurotype perspective, where do you land in this conversation?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. What I look at it is enhanced receptivity and enhanced processing. So when you're talking about intensities, the work of early on with Kazimierz Dabrowski and the work of Susan Daniels with her book Living Intensity, um, and James T. Webb, I think a lot of that makes sense when you're talking about gifted processing. But the way that I kind of try to translate it in terms of the brain, which has to do with really enhanced networks for that types of processing. I think the word intensity it may rub people the wrong way. I also think that sometimes it can, in some ways, people think, well, that's just my intensity. That's the way I am. I don't have to change or whatnot. And when you think about it in terms of neuroanatomy, enhanced receptivity and processing, then you're better able to identify where the origin of the behavior is. And so I think that we can get into a thing if we don't pay attention to where the origin of the behaviors arising and just kind of slough it off as an intensity, we can in some ways do a disservice because we may not be supporting the child or adult in the right way if that isn't the cause, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love your thoughts there. You should do a presentation for a presentation on that itself, and that you bring up that the word intensity itself may not be the right word to use, that it may rub some people the wrong way, and yeah, interesting. I see it. I'm a literature major, so I love how intensity has been described as a more textured way of experiencing the world. And just like, how you can dive into a novel or a story and it's so textured and layered and it's just so immersive. But it may not feel intense to you. Like reading is not necessarily an intense, that's not the right word for reading, maybe intent. I don't know. I'm just I know I'm going all over the place, but thank you
No,
for your thoughts on that.
but I think that's the thing is I think that's what's so important when we think about words and language and how they make, they can make the case and they can help communicate. And so, sometimes we can misunderstand each other, because we're thinking about the different definition of the word. And so when we can collectively come together and have better words to identify the population, to identify our experiences, then I think we can more articulate, them to educational boards, and that's where we get in. I always think about the word disability, versus learning difference, and how the word disability could simply cause a child to have low self-esteem, thinking that they're less than. And so I really try to advocate and use the word learning difference. But when you go into the school system, you have to have the word disability to get the service. And so we're kind of in this loophole. And so I think it's really good that we're questioning and we're wanting to refine the language and better identify the experience. And, you know, a lot of people have asked me about, you know, the intensities, and I wrote about it as about enhanced experiences in the book. And I also pointed out too, where I think something got a little lost in translation, where with sensorial, where they said sensual, and I think it was actually sensorial for the five senses. So I actually changed it. So because I think it matters, because since, you know, sensual means actually sexual. So like we have to make sure we're using the right words. So if we're talking about the senses, the five senses. So
Yeah, we are animals who use language, aren't we amazing?
yeah.
We're coming down to the end of our time here, and would just like to thank you in advance, and I'll thank you a little bit more later, but I've got a couple announcements if you don't mind staying with
Sure.
us for a
Yeah.
minute or two.